Papa tu, papa tu, papa tu, papa tu, papa mai kawa tu, papa mai nuku tu, papa mai rangi tu, papa mai runga tu, papa mai raro. O i te runanga tāne ka mau, o i te pūkenga tāne ka kōkiri, o i o whiwhi o rāwea tūrau pārea. Tēnei te wairea o ihi hinuku o ihi hirangi. Ko te mauri ka mau ka tākea wairea i runga wairea i raro wairea i ngā tuputupu a tāne. Ko tāne nui ārangi, ko tāne te waiora, ko tāne nuku, ko tāne mironga. Ko tāne i te pupuke, ko tāne i te kukune, ko tāne i te korenga, ko tāne ngā hoa, ko tāne mahuta. Tēnei te tuawhā ka kawa ka wairea ki runga i tēnei papa ka wairea kia eke te taumata o mātangi a re ia uhi. Wero, taumai te mauri haumi e hui e, tae ki e. What is decolonising in Aotearoa? Decolonising in Aotearoa is a kaupapa Māori podcast that focuses on promoting kōrero and whakaaro about the process of decolonisation for ngā taangata katoa. Decolonising in Aotearoa is hosted by Parker Davis and is written and produced by Wetere Paki. Seeing cultural dominance. In the previous episode, we looked at some of the colonial narratives about taangata whenua and how they function to uphold the validity of the colony and thus maintain its power. In this episode, we will discuss the process of identifying sites within ourselves and our surrounding environments which are colonised, and how we might go about transforming these sites through decolonisation. The first site that we will concentrate on is our own cultural identity as taangata whenua. Before we begin, it is important for us to remember that colonisation creates dominance and oppression. This dominance is not just limited to the physical act, it also pertains to other things like culture and identity. By establishing cultural dominance, the colony and the colonial settlers are able to include or exclude other cultures because they sit in a position of power. This power comes from belonging to the dominant culture, which in turn privileges those who belong, while excluding or othering those who sit outside. Often, cultural dominance allows the dominant culture to appear neutral or become invisible. By appearing neutral, the dominant culture is not often interrogated, as those living within it view its dominance as natural or normal. To begin decolonising ourselves, we must make the dominant culture visible, so that we can identify what aspects of our own cultural identity belong to it, and whether this results in thoughts, actions, and ideologies that harm ourselves and our own communities. When examining our own cultural identity, we must also remember that decolonisation is not an exercise in recreating a romanticised version of the past. Nor is it an exercise in cultural essentialism, where we try to attain a level of pure Māoritanga. Instead, we can view decolonisation as a lens which we use to examine the whakapapa of our cultural identity in relation to the dominant culture, how this impacts on how we see ourselves, our communities, and our surrounding environments. Decolonisation of identity is an exercise for Indigenous people that allows us to use our tino rangatiratanga, our agency, to define who and what we are. However, to do this authentically, we must first know how colonisation creates cultural dominance and acknowledge how this impacts on us and our identities. Thus, we must become aware of the unequal power dynamic between the cultures of the colonizer and the colonized within the colony, and what the intention and function of this is. Nō reira, as taangata whenua, how do we see our identity? Are we Indigenous people living on our whenua? Or are we members of the colony, whose cultural identity is built around colonial narratives and ways of doing and being? The first pātai we can ask ourselves is whether we see being taangata whenua, being Māori, as a positive thing. Do we take pride in being Indigenous, or do we aspire to be like the colonizer? Do we see value and worth in being Māori? Do we encourage our tamariki to be proud of being Māori? Or do we encourage them to aspire to be like the colonizer? If the answer is no, being taangata whenua is not positive, then we must ask why. What has been taught to us about ourselves that creates a desire within us to no longer be our natural selves? What images have we been shown of ourselves? What narratives have we been taught? And what standards of beauty and success have we been socialized to aspire to? When we ask these questions, we must remember the function of the dominant culture and its ability to validate and invalidate, to create narratives that ensure that it retains its dominance by convincing those who do not conform of its superiority. As we examine our identity, we must look within our own whakaaro and how they inform our actions. Do we perpetuate that narrative that being taangata whenua is negative? Often, examples of antisocial or dysfunctional behaviour from within our community are used by both the colonizer and the colonised to reinforce indigenous inferiority. These examples fit into the colonial narrative and work to devalue indigeneity while also privileging the colonial culture. If we were to decolonize our perspective of this behavior, we can see that it has occurred as an outcome of colonization, namely intergenerational trauma, poverty, and the destruction of social structures and protocols which guide pro-social behavior. Knowing this does not relieve us of our responsibility for our own behavior, nor does it minimize the harm caused by this behavior or negate the need for addressing our issues. However, it allows us to see that the negative behavior in our communities is not caused by Māoritanga or by whakapapa Māori. As taangata whenua, when we take on this narrative that being Māori is negative and perpetuate it through our words and actions, we not only colonize our own identity, but we also participate in the colonization of others in our own community. In simpler terms, we are doing the colonizing for the colonizer. Another pātai to ask ourselves is how we see our whakapapa. Whakapapa is the foundation upon which we stand. It can give us stability, location, purpose, and accountability. Generations after generations of tupuna who lived so that we exist, creating connections that span thousands of years, while also connecting us to each other as we live in our contemporary times. Whakapapa also connects us to whenua and to other geographical identity locators. For example, through whakapapa, we connect to maunga, to awa, to marae. These places connect us to others, to a wider collective, and help us to build relationships with both taangata and the taiao. If whakapapa is not part of our identity, we must ask why. For many of us, we have been forcibly disconnected from knowing our whakapapa. Through dislocation, forced removal of whanaunga through adoption, or social assimilation whereby our tupuna put aside knowledge of whakapapa to ensure they and their mokopuna survived in a colonial society. We must be aware that this is an intentional outcome of colonization. Disconnection from whakapapa works to undermine indigenous identities because it limits how the indigenous person can locate themselves within an identity and a culture that is theirs. Often, the only option that appears to be left is to further assimilate into the colonial culture and identity. To begin to decolonize ourselves in relation to our whakapapa is to privilege whakapapa as a defining part of our identity. This does not mean that we are required to know our entire whakapapa to be decolonized, but rather to shift our perspective and be compelled to know and participate in our whakapapa. To be aware of the multitude of tupuna who existed before us, and of the generations of mokopuna to come who will see us as tupuna. Some of us have trauma attached to our whakapapa that is a barrier for reconnection. As taangata whenua, we must tautoko our whanaunga by listening and respecting each other's experiences and perspectives, because the impact of colonisation is both varied and nuanced. We can encourage each other by reminding ourselves that we are also tupuna for our tamariki and mokopuna, and we can create new narratives and experiences for our uri that result in intergenerational positivity. Mō kuake, to understand that we are simultaneously mokopuna, uri, and tupuna, and to act in a way that reflects this, is to reject colonisation and its narratives, and to assert an indigenous perspective on identity. Many of us are descendants of both tangata whenua and tauiwi, or Pākehā. By taking an indigenous perspective rather than a colonial one, we privilege the concept of whakapapa. This allows us to acknowledge where our tupuna come from and how we are connected through them to different whenua and people. Moreover, we are acknowledging the whakapapa connections between us and others without upholding colonial narratives of racial superiority. Racist narratives and notions of racial superiority are employed in colonisation to create hierarchy between the coloniser and the colonised. Racism is used as a tool by the coloniser to exert power over the colonised. This includes the creating of social power structures that privilege the coloniser. Within a colonial state, it is communicated to us implicitly and explicitly to seek the same privileges. Often, we are told that we are not that Māori or don't look that Māori. These narratives work to privilege whakapapa Pākehā while invalidating our whakapapa Māori, thus reinforcing the superiority of the colonial identity over that of taangata whenua. We must be aware of how colonisation works to assimilate us into the colonial identity by creating structures of power and privilege. Privilege which can only be accessed by disregarding our indigenous identity and whakapapa Māori, or limiting how we express them so that it does not challenge colonial cultural dominance. If we examine the colonial identity and how it functions, we can see that it works together with the cultural dominance of colonizer to position itself as a norm or neutral. By appearing neutral, it attempts to distance itself from the wider historical context in which it was created and established, namely, how the process of colonization was used by the colonizer to establish cultural dominance over the colonized. In a colonial state where there is cultural dominance, there is often only one narrative, one cultural perspective, and one cultural identity. This is communicated through the media, through film, arts, popular culture. This single cultural identity serves to homogenize all people living within the colony, including indigenous people. It is important for us as taangata whenua to remember that this identity is not neutral, nor was it created in a neutral way. While certain aspects of the indigenous cultural identity are sometimes included in the colonial identity, the colonial culture remains dominant within it and uses its power to include or exclude other cultural identities to varying degrees. By establishing and maintaining a single colonial cultural identity, the colonizer attempts to erase previous cultures and identities. Attempts to establish and validate indigenous culture and identities within a colonial state are obstructed by those who are invested in or privileged by the colonial identity and culture. This is done by labeling any indigenous initiative to establish identity and culture as being divisive, separatist, or enacting cultural apartheid. These narratives serve to protect and maintain colonial power and cultural dominance. For example, the Kiwi versus Iwi slogan used in politics to obstruct or undermine initiatives which aim to uphold Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the Waitangi tribunal processes. The slogan positions taangata whenua as being the other, who are exploitative and combative, while the term Kiwi, as an indigenous word, is used to define a colonial national identity, one which does not appear to include iwi identity for taangata whenua. Although both words are of the same indigenous language, the unequal power dynamic between colonizer and colonized allows the colonizer to create a narrative which appropriates the term Kiwi, then decontextualizes it and redefines it within a colonial cultural context. This narrative positions any person or initiative that attempts to assert or support taangata whenua status as un-Kiwi and gives us two binary identities to choose from. Moreover, it communicates to us that to be Kiwi, we must remove our iwi identity. This also tells us that the dominant culture within the Kiwi identity is not Māori, and therefore, as taangata whenua, we are required to relinquish our culture or retain it in a way that is palatable to the dominant culture in order to belong. As I have mentioned, this Kiwi versus iwi narrative has a clear function. It works to combat and invalidate other cultural identities which may challenge its dominance. Those who perpetuate this narrative employ racism and emotional violence as tools to maintain power as a means of reinvestment back into the colonial power structure which they gain privilege from. Therefore, the colonial identity and its narratives are inherently violent when used to maintain cultural dominance and power over indigenous people. Nō reira e te iwi. When we look at our identity, how do we define ourselves? Are we aware of the cultural dominance created by colonization? And are we complicit in perpetuating it? Do we define our identity using colonial standards? And do our actions cause others to conform to these same colonial ideals? The process of decolonisation is an internal process which begins by looking at ourselves as taangata whenua and asking whether we see a colonial identity or an indigenous identity. We must remember that we are all colonised to some degree. But despite this, our whakapapa and our indigeneity never changes, although at times it may feel like it can. Once we know this, we can begin to decolonize and transform ourselves, our communities, our environments. We are both descendants and ancestors.